The train's whistle pierced the Montana dawn like a wounded animal crying for mercy. Margaret Whitfield pressed her gloved hand against the frost-covered window, watching the endless prairie roll past in waves of golden grass that seemed to stretch beyond the edge of the world. In her lap sat a worn leather satchel containing everything she owned: 3 dresses, a Bible her mother had pressed into her hands before the fever took her, $12 in crumpled bills, and a single letter that had changed the course of her life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The letter was folded so many times the creases had worn thin as spider silk. She didn't need to read it again. Every word was burned into her memory like a brand on cattle hide. Seeking respectable woman for marriage and companionship. Own 160 acres of good farmland near Millbrook, Montana. House established, income steady. No drink, no gambling. God-fearing man seeks the same in wife. Reply if serious. It was signed by Thomas Brennan in careful script, and beneath that, an address that had become her destination and her hope. Margaret had written back 3 times before finding the courage to post the letter. The first draft had been too desperate, the second too formal, the third too familiar. Finally, she had settled on simple honesty. She was 26, unmarried, alone in the world since her parents' death, possessed of basic domestic skills, and willing to travel west for the promise of a home and family. She had not mentioned the debts her father's illness had left behind, or the landlord who had given her 30 days to vacate the boarding house room in Philadelphia, or the fact that she had never so much as held a man's hand, let alone kissed one. The correspondence that followed had been brief but encouraging. Thomas Brennan wrote that he was 34, had been widowed 2 years, and was in need of a woman's touch around his homestead. He described the Montana Territory as harsh but honest land, where a person could build something lasting if they weren't afraid of hard work. He had enclosed $25 for train fare and promised to meet her at the Millbrook station on October 15th at 3 o'clock. In the afternoon. That was yesterday. Today, Margaret clutched her ticket stub and tried to calm the thundering of her heart as the conductor called out stations with names that sounded like poetry written in a foreign tongue. Bitter Creek, Sage Hollow, Devil's Backbone. Each mile carried her further from everything familiar and deeper into a landscape that looked like God had forgotten to finish creating it. The other passengers in the car paid her little attention. A traveling salesman with pomade-slicked hair dozed against the window, his sample case balanced precariously on his knees. 2 cowboys heading to winter work at a ranch near Billings played cards with the focused intensity of men gambling with their last dimes. An elderly woman in black morning dress knitted something that might become a scarf or might become a noose, her needles clicking in rhythm with the train wheels. Margaret had tried to imagine what Thomas Brennan might look like, but the single tintype photograph he had sent showed a man standing so far from the camera that his features were lost in shadow. She could tell he was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore the kind of practical clothes that spoke of outdoor work, but beyond that, he remained a mystery wrapped in hope and desperation. The train began to slow as they approached a cluster of buildings that barely qualified as a town. Millbrook, Montana consisted of a general store, a saloon, a church with a steeple that leaned slightly to the left, and perhaps 24 houses scattered along a single dirt street like seeds thrown carelessly by a distracted farmer. Beyond the town, the prairie stretched in all directions, broken only by the dark line of mountains that rose in the distance like sleeping giants. Margaret gathered her belongings and smoothed her travel dress, a dark blue wool that her mother had sewn for her years before. It was the finest thing she owned, though the fabric had worn thin at the elbows and the hem showed signs of repeated letting down and taking up as fashions changed. She had pinned her auburn hair as carefully as the swaying train would allow, tucking the rebellious curls beneath. A small hat that had seen better decades. The platform was little more than weathered planks laid across wooden supports. As Margaret stepped down from the train, her heel caught in a gap between boards, and she stumbled, nearly dropping her satchel. The salesman pushed past her without a word, followed by the cowboys who tipped their hats politely but didn't offer assistance. The elderly woman with the knitting smiled sympathetically but was met by a young man who helped her toward a waiting wagon. Margaret stood alone on the platform as the train wheezed and clanked its way toward the next settlement, leaving behind a cloud of coal smoke and the sudden silence of a place where not much happened and even less was expected to. She scanned the faces of the few people scattered around the station area. A shopkeeper swept the steps of his store. A dog with ribs showing through matted fur picked through garbage behind the saloon. 2 children chased a hoop down the dusty street, their laughter the only sound that seemed to have any life in it. But there was no Thomas Brennan. No man stepped forward to claim her, no one approached with recognition in their eyes. Margaret checked the small watch pinned to her dress. Front, 3:20 in the afternoon. Perhaps he had been delayed. Perhaps his clock ran differently than the railroads. Perhaps he was shy and waiting to see if she would recognize him first. She walked the length of the platform twice, her traveling boots clicking against the worn planks. She peered through the window of the general store, hoping to see a man who might be watching for her arrival. The shopkeeper looked up from his sweeping and touched the brim of his hat in greeting, but his expression held only polite curiosity, not recognition. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of copper and rose that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Margaret's throat felt dry from the train journey, and her stomach reminded her that she had eaten nothing since dawn, except a hard biscuit and an apple that had seen better days. She approached the shopkeeper, who had finished his sweeping and was preparing to close up for the day. "Excuse me, sir," she said, and was surprised by how small her voice sounded in the vast openness of the prairie air. "I'm looking for Thomas Brennan. He was supposed to meet me here at 3 o'clock. The man's weathered face creased into a frown. He was perhaps 50 years old, with the kind of deep tan that came from decades of outdoor work and the lined eyes of someone who had seen too many harsh winters. "Brennan, you say? Thomas Brennan?" He scratched his graying beard and shook his head slowly. "Miss, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but Thomas Brennan died near 3 weeks ago. Took sick sudden-like and was gone before Doc Crawford could do much of anything for him." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She felt the blood drain from her face and her knees went weak beneath her. "Dead?" she whispered. "But I'm supposed to. We were to be married. I've come all the way from Philadelphia." The shopkeeper's expression softened with understanding and something that might have been pity. "You must be the mail-order bride he mentioned to folks. He seemed right excited about your coming. Talked about it quite a bit in the weeks before. He passed. Name's Samuel Morrison, by the way. I own the general store here." Margaret's hand went to her throat, where she could feel her pulse beating like a trapped bird. "But what am I supposed to do? I have nowhere to go. I spent everything I had on that train ticket." Samuel Morrison looked uncomfortable, the way men do when faced with a woman's distress and no clear solution to offer. "Well, now that's a puzzle, isn't it? I suppose you could take the next train back east, though that won't be until Thursday, and you'd need money for the fare." "I don't have money for the fare," Margaret said, and the admission felt like swallowing ground glass. "I spent my last dollars getting here." Morrison shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly wishing this problem would solve itself or at least become someone else's responsibility. "Mrs. Henderson runs a boarding house of sorts. Might put you up for a few days while you figure things out. Though I should warn you, she's particular about payment in advance." Margaret's mind raced through her limited options. She could wire her cousin Sarah in Boston, But Sarah barely managed to feed her own family and had made it clear that Margaret's problems were her own to solve. She could try to find work in Millbrook, but the town was barely large enough to support the businesses it already had, and she doubted there was much call for a woman with her limited skills. "There is one thing," Morrison said slowly, as if the words were reluctant to leave his tongue. "Thomas Brennan's place is still sitting empty. He had no family that anyone knows of, and the bank's been trying to figure out what to do with the property. It's not much to look at, and it's a fair ride from town, but it's got 4 walls and a roof. Maybe you could stay there temporarily while you sort things out." "Is that legal?" Margaret asked. "I mean, wouldn't that be trespassing?" Morrison shrugged. "Legal's a flexible concept out here, miss. Bank won't foreclose until spring at the earliest, and winter's coming on fast. Empty house doesn't do anybody any good, and you need shelter. Way I see it, you're solving each other's problems, at least for now." The offer was far from ideal, but it was better than sleeping in the street or begging for charity from strangers. "How far is it from town?" "About 8 miles northwest. There's a trail that's not too hard to follow if you know what to look for. I could have my boy Jake drive you out there come morning, if you've a mind to try it." Margaret looked around at the dying town, the endless prairie, the sky that seemed too big for the earth beneath it. Everything in her wanted to flee, to find some way back to the familiar streets of Philadelphia, even if it meant poverty and uncertainty. But there was nowhere to flee to, and no money to flee with. "I suppose I don't have much choice," she said. Finally, Morrison nodded as if he had expected this answer. "You can spend the night in my store. Got a cot in the back room I use sometimes when inventory runs late. Won't charge you nothing for it, seeing as how you've had such a shock." That night, Margaret lay on the narrow cot surrounded by sacks of flour and beans, listening to the wind howl across the prairie like the voices of lost souls. She had never heard wind like that in Philadelphia, where buildings broke its force and gave it something to push against. Out here, it had nothing to stop it but distance, and it seemed to carry all the loneliness of the world. She pulled the thin blanket. Morrison had given her up to her chin and tried not to think about what she would find at Thomas Brennan's homestead. In her mind, she pictured a neat farmhouse with painted shutters and a garden plot waiting for spring planting. She imagined herself learning to milk cows and churn butter, maybe getting some chickens, making a life from the raw materials of land and hard work. But as sleep finally took her, her dreams were filled with empty houses and prairie wind, and the growing certainty that nothing in Montana was going to be as simple as the letters had made it seem. The next morning, it dawned clear and cold, with frost coating every surface like sugar on a cake. Jake Morrison turned out to be a boy of perhaps 16, tall and gangling with his father's eyes, but his mother's gentle manner. He helped Margaret load her few possessions into the back of a wagon pulled by 2 horses that looked as weathered and practical as everything else in Montana. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The ride to the Brennan place took nearly 2 hours over what could generously be called a trail. It was little more than wagon ruts worn into the prairie grass, winding around rocks and gullies, following the path of least resistance rather than any logical direction. Jake kept up a steady stream of conversation, pointing out landmarks that meant nothing to Margaret but seemed important to him. The lightning-struck tree where old Charlie Hendricks had sheltered during the storm of '79, the creek that ran good water except in the driest years, the hill where you could see clear to the mountains on a clear day dot as they crested a low rise. Jake pointed ahead with his whip. "There she is," he said, "the Brennan place." Margaret's heart sank as she saw what awaited her. The house was small and unpainted, its wood weathered to a silvery gray that spoke of years exposed to prairie sun and wind. The roof sagged slightly. In the middle, and one of the front windows was covered with a piece of canvas that flapped in the morning breeze like a flag of surrender. A barn leaned at an angle that suggested it was held upright more by habit than by sound construction. But, as they drew closer, Margaret began to notice signs that someone had once cared about this place. There were the remains of a garden plot, marked by neat rows and a few stubborn plants that had survived the early frost. The front door was painted a cheerful blue, though the paint was peeling. A wooden bench sat on the narrow porch, positioned to catch the morning sun. Jake helped her down from the wagon and carried her satchel to the front door. The door was unlocked, another reminder that this was not Philadelphia, where people barricaded themselves behind multiple locks and still worried about thieves. "You sure about this, miss?" Jake asked as they stood on the threshold. "It's mighty lonely out here, especially for a woman alone. Nearest neighbor is the Patterson place, about 4 miles south, and they're not exactly sociable folk." Margaret squared her shoulders and lifted her chin. "I'm sure," she said, though she was anything but sure. "Thank you for bringing me out here." Jake nodded and touched his hat brim. "I'll tell Pa where you are, in case anybody needs to find you. And miss, there's a rifle hanging over the mantel inside. Thomas always said a person needed to be able to protect themselves out here. You know how to shoot." Margaret shook her head. She had never so much as held a gun. "Might want to learn," Jake said quietly. "Prairie can be a dangerous place for those who aren't prepared for it." After the wagon disappeared over the rise, leaving her alone with nothing but wind and sky for company, Margaret pushed open the blue door and stepped into what was to become her new home. The interior was dim and smelled of wood smoke and something sweet and cloying that made her stomach turn. The main room was larger than she had expected, with a stone fireplace along one wall and a kitchen area with a cast-iron stove along another. A ladder led to what appeared to be a sleeping loft above, but it was the silence that struck her most forcefully. Not just the absence of sound, but the presence of emptiness, as if the very air was holding its breath. Margaret set down her satchel and walked slowly through the house, her footsteps echoing in the hollow spaces. The bedroom was small but clean, with a bed frame but no mattress. The kitchen had basic supplies, some dishes, a few pots, a sack of flour that felt light when she lifted it. Everything was covered with a fine layer of dust that spoke of weeks without human presence. It was when she climbed the ladder to explore the loft that Margaret made the discovery that would change everything. The space under the eaves was being used for storage, filled with trunks and boxes and the accumulated possessions of a life cut short. But pushed against the far wall, almost hidden in the shadows, were 7 small pallets arranged in neat rows. 7 beds. Child-sized beds, each with a thin blanket and a pillow that had been carefully placed at the head. Margaret stared at them in confusion. Thomas Brennan had never mentioned children in his letters. He had said he was widowed, but he had never said anything about being a father. She descended the ladder with her mind racing. If Thomas had children, where were they? Had they been sent to relatives after his death? Were they in an orphanage somewhere? Or, and this thought made her blood run cold, were they still here somewhere, hiding, or lost, or worse? Margaret grabbed the rifle from above the mantel, though she had no idea how to use it, and stepped back outside. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, offering no clues, no answers. But somewhere in the wind, she thought she heard something that didn't belong to the natural sounds of the wilderness. Somewhere, faint as a whisper, came the sound of a child crying. Dawn broke gray and bitter, with frost painting intricate patterns on the windows and a wind that cut through the cabin walls like they were made of paper. Margaret woke to find Timothy curled against her side in the rocking chair, his small body radiating heat like a tiny furnace. Her neck ached from sleeping upright, and her arm had gone numb where his head rested, but she didn't move. The boy had slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, and she would endure any discomfort to preserve that small miracle. The other children were beginning to stir on their makeshift beds. Emma sat up first, her blonde hair catching the dim morning light as she automatically began checking on the younger ones. It was a habit born of necessity. Margaret realized this 10-year-old girl had been playing mother to 6 siblings while fighting her own hunger and fear. "Morning," Emma whispered, careful not to wake the babies. "Did Timothy have bad dreams?" "Just one," Margaret replied softly, gently stroking the boy's hair. "But he settled down when I sang to him." Emma's expression brightened with something. "That might have been relief. Ma used to sing when we couldn't sleep. Pa tried after she died, but he couldn't carry a tune in a bucket." The mention of their parents brought shadows back to Emma's face, but she pushed them aside with the practiced efficiency of a child who had learned that grief was a luxury she couldn't afford. She began waking the others, starting with Rebecca, whose cough had worsened during the night. Margaret eased Timothy from her lap and began building up the fire. The logs Thomas Brennan had cut were well seasoned and caught quickly, filling the cabin with blessed warmth and the comforting scent of burning pine. But even as she worked, her mind was calculating how long the wood pile would last, how many meals she could make from the remaining supplies, how many days they had before reality came calling in the form of empty stomachs and empty pantries. Daniel was the last to wake, and when he did, it was with the instant alertness of someone who had learned to be ready for danger at all times. His eyes found Margaret first, then quickly scanned the room to ensure all his siblings were accounted for. Only when he was satisfied that everyone was safe did he allow himself to relax. "What's the plan?" he asked, and Margaret was struck by how naturally he assumed there would be a plan, how readily he accepted her leadership despite having known her less than 24 hours. Margaret wished she had a plan. She wished she understood farming or hunting or any of the practical skills required to keep 7 children alive through a Montana winter. But all she had was determination and the growing certainty that she would learn whatever she needed to. Do whatever she needed to do to keep this family together. "First, we need to take inventory," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Figure out what supplies we have, what we need, and how long everything will last." They spent the morning cataloging their resources, and the results were sobering. The root cellar contained perhaps 2 weeks' worth of preserved vegetables and dried meat, assuming they rationed carefully. The flour sack held maybe 10 pounds, enough for bread if she could figure out how to make it rise properly. There were a dozen eggs from the chickens, some hard cheese, and a few pounds of beans that would need to be soaked overnight before cooking. The children proved to be valuable sources of information about their father's survival strategies. Daniel knew where Thomas had set snares for rabbits and which creek pools usually held fish even in late autumn. Emma could identify edible plants and knew how to preserve meat by smoking it over a slow fire. Even little Rebecca contributed, showing Margaret where their mother had kept her herb garden and which plants could be used for medicine. But it was Samuel, limping on his injured foot, who made the most important discovery. While exploring the barn, he found Thomas Brennan's hidden cache, a wooden box buried beneath loose hay that contained $23 in silver coins, a detailed map of the surrounding area marked with hunting and fishing spots, and most importantly, a letter addressed to whoever finds this. Margaret's hands trembled as she read Thomas Brennan's final message, written in the same careful script she remembered from his courtship letters. "If you are reading this, I am dead and my children are alone. I have tried to prepare for this possibility, but a man can only do so much against fate. The money should buy supplies for the winter if used carefully. The Petersons to the south are good people but cannot take on 7 more mouths to feed. Sheriff Hawkins means well but will split the family according to law. My dying wish is that my children stay together. They are all each other has in this world. If you have found them, if you are reading this, Please see them safe. They know how to work, how to survive. They just need someone to love them." The letter was dated 3 days before his death. Thomas Brennan had known his time was running short and had tried to arrange for every contingency except the one that actually occurred: his children hiding from the very help he had hoped would find them. Margaret folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her dress pocket. $23 wouldn't last forever, but it was enough to buy time, enough to figure out how to make this impossible situation work. "What does it say?" Daniel asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the heart of it. "Your father loved you very much," Margaret said simply, "and he wanted you to stay together no matter what." That afternoon, she hitched Thomas's horses to his wagon and made the journey to Millbrook with Daniel beside her, and strict instructions for Emma to keep the younger children hidden if anyone came around. The ride gave her time to think, to plan, to prepare for the careful balancing act she was about to attempt. Samuel Morrison looked surprised to see her back so soon. "Miss Whitfield, didn't expect you again quite yet. How are you settling in at Brennan Place?" "It's larger than I expected," Margaret said carefully. "I was hoping to buy some supplies. Flour, beans, maybe some coffee if you have it." Morrison began gathering items from his shelves while Margaret wandered the store, pretending to browse while actually listening to the conversations of the other customers. Two women discussed the weather and their concerns about an early winter. A rancher complained about losing cattle to wolves. But it was the conversation between Morrison and the local minister that caught her attention. "Sheriff's been asking around about the Brennan children again," Reverend Matthews was saying. "Seems they never did turn up at that orphanage in Helena. Hawkins is starting to wonder if something happened to them." "Could they ran off?" Morrison suggested. "Daniel's old enough to think he could take care of the younger ones. Pride runs strong in that family." "Pride doesn't keep you alive through winter," Matthews replied grimly. "If those children are still out there somewhere, they're going to be in serious trouble once the snow starts." Margaret's hand stilled on a bolt of cloth as she absorbed this information. The authorities weren't just looking for the children, they were actively searching. It was only a matter of time before someone thought to check the family homestead more thoroughly. She completed her purchases quickly, buying enough supplies to last several weeks but not so much as to arouse suspicion. Morrison chatted easily as he tallied her bill, mentioning that the banker from Billings would be coming through next week to assess the Brennan property, wondering aloud what would happen to the place now that Thomas was gone. The ride back to the homestead was tense, with new urgency. Margaret's mind raced through possibilities, scenarios, escape plans that all seemed inadequate. Against the growing certainty that their time was running out, Daniel sensed her mood and rode in silence for most of the journey. But as they neared the cabin, he finally spoke. "We heard what the preacher said about Sheriff Hawkins. We're going to have to run again, aren't we?" Margaret looked at the boy beside her, barely 13 years old but carrying the weight of responsibility for 6 younger siblings. His face was set in the grim acceptance of someone who had already lost everything once and was prepared to lose it again. "No," she said firmly, "we're not running anywhere. This is your home, and we're going to find a way to keep it. But if the sheriff comes, he'll find a woman living in her deceased fiance's house, taking care of the property until legal matters are settled. There's nothing unusual about that." Daniel frowned. "But what about us? 7 kids can't just disappear." Margaret smiled, though there was steel beneath the warmth. 7 kids can't disappear, but one woman and her, let's say her visiting nieces and nephews. Well, that's different entirely. They reached the cabin as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of copper and rose that made the prairie look like it was on fire. The other children rushed out to greet them, and Margaret's heart contracted at their obvious relief that she had returned. In the space of a single day, she had become their anchor, their security, their proof that abandonment wasn't inevitable, Over dinner, beans and cornbread that Emma had managed to bake while they were gone, Margaret outlined her plan. It was simple in concept but complex in execution. If anyone asked, she was Margaret Brennan, Thomas's widow, though they had been married by a traveling preacher just before his death. The children were her late husband's nieces and nephews, orphaned back east and sent to live with their uncle, arriving just before his untimely death. "Can you remember that story?" she asked. "All of you?" The children nodded solemnly. They understood the stakes, understood that their survival depended on maintaining this fiction. Emma immediately began coaching the younger ones, helping them memorize their new identities as visiting relatives rather than direct children of Thomas Brennan. But it was Lucy who asked the question that went to the heart of everything. "Does this mean you're our mama now?" The silence that followed was profound. 7 pairs of eyes watched Margaret's face, waiting for an answer that would shape the rest of their lives. She thought of Thomas Brennan's letter, his dying wish that his children stay together. She thought of her own empty life in Philadelphia, the future that had disappeared when she stepped off that train in Millbrook. "If you want me to be," she said softly. Timothy was the first to nod, followed quickly by Lucy. Rebecca smiled shyly and leaned against Margaret's shoulder. The twins exchanged one of their wordless communications and nodded in unison. Emma's eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "Yes, please." Daniel was the last to answer, the weight of leadership making him cautious about decisions that couldn't be undone, but finally he too nodded. "Pa would have liked you," he said simply. "Ma too." And so it was decided. Margaret Whitfield, the spinster from Philadelphia who had come west to marry a stranger, became Margaret Brennan, widow and mother to 7 children who needed her more than she had ever needed anything. The transformation wasn't just one of names and stories. That night, as she tucked the children into their beds and listened to their whispered prayers that now included gratitude for Mama Margaret, she felt something shift inside her chest. The frightened, desperate woman who had arrived in Millbrook was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone with purpose, someone who would fight heaven and earth to protect the family she had found in the most unlikely place. Outside, the wind howled across the prairie with promises of winter storms and harsh challenges ahead. But inside the cabin, 7 children slept peacefully under the watchful eyes of their new mother. And Margaret Brennan, for that was who she was now, began to plan for a future that seemed impossible but felt as necessary as breathing. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The banker from Billings, the suspicious sheriff, the approaching winter that would test their ability to survive. But tonight, she had 7 children who called her Mama, and that was worth fighting for. Worth everything. The banker arrived on a Tuesday morning when the frost lay thick as cotton batting across the prairie and the children were huddled around the kitchen table practicing their lessons. Margaret had found Thomas Brennan's collection of books, a surprising treasure trove that included readers, arithmetic primers, and even a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets, and had appointed herself their teacher. Education, she reasoned, was armor against a world that would judge them harshly for their circumstances. She spotted the black carriage from the window while helping Rebecca sound out words in McGuffey's reader. The vehicle looked official and expensive, pulled by 2 matched bay horses that stepped high and nervous in the cold air. Margaret's stomach clenched, but she forced her voice to remain steady as she addressed the children. "Emma, take the little ones upstairs to play quietly. Daniel, you and the twins continue with your arithmetic problems. Remember what we practiced." The children scattered like birds before a storm, but with purpose rather than panic. They had rehearsed this moment dozens of times over the past 2 weeks, and their movements were smooth and coordinated. By the time the banker's knock echoed through the cabin, Margaret had transformed from anxious guardian into composed widow, her posture straight and her expression appropriately solemn. The man who stood on her doorstep was exactly what she had expected: middle-aged, well-dressed, with the soft hands and pale complexion of someone who had never worked outdoors. He removed his hat with practiced courtesy, revealing thinning hair slicked back with pomade. "Mrs. Brennan? I'm Charles Hartwell from the First National Bank of Billings. I believe you received my letter regarding the assessment of this property." Margaret had received no such letter, but she nodded graciously and stepped aside to allow him entry. "Of course, Mr. Hartwell, please come in. I apologize for the modest accommodations. We're still adjusting to our circumstances." Hartwell's eyes swept the cabin interior, taking note of the children's books scattered on the table, the makeshift beds that Margaret had arranged to look like temporary sleeping quarters for visitors, the overall atmosphere of a household making do in difficult times. His gaze lingered on Daniel, who sat hunched over his slate with the intense concentration of a boy determined to appear ordinary. "These would be your visiting relatives?" Hartwell asked, consulting a leather portfolio he carried. "My late husband's nieces and nephews," Margaret confirmed, her voice catching slightly on the word husband, not from deception, but from the strange emotion that accompanied claiming Thomas Brennan as her own. "They arrived from Ohio just before Thomas passed. Poor dears have nowhere else to go. 7 children is quite a burden for a woman in your position," Hartwell observed, though his tone was more curious than gentle. "Have you considered the practical difficulties of maintaining this property alone?" Margaret gestured toward the kitchen area, where she had prepared coffee in anticipation of this visit. "Would you care for refreshment while we discuss the situation? I find these matters go more smoothly with proper hospitality." As she poured coffee into Thomas's good china cups, another treasure discovered in a cabinet that spoke of a more prosperous past, Margaret told the story she had crafted with meticulous care. She and Thomas had corresponded for months before her journey west. They had been married in a simple ceremony by a traveling preacher named Reverend Michaels, witnessed by neighbors who had since moved on to California. Thomas had insisted on the marriage despite his failing health, wanting to ensure she would have legal claim to the property should anything happen to him. The children arrived by train just 3 days before the wedding. She continued, adding sugar to Hartwell's coffee with steady hands. Thomas was so excited to meet them, to give them a proper home. His death was unexpected and devastating. Hartwell made notes in his portfolio, occasionally glancing up to observe Margaret's demeanor. She had practiced this performance until it felt almost natural, drawing on memories of genuinely grieving widows she had known in Philadelphia. The key was to project quiet dignity rather than dramatic sorrow, competence rather than helplessness. "The marriage certificate?" Hartwell inquired. Margaret's heart hammered, but her expression remained composed. "Lost in the fire that took the Michaels wagon 2 weeks after the ceremony. Terrible tragedy. The good Reverend and his wife were traveling to a new settlement when their camp was struck by lightning. We were fortunate to have witnesses to the marriage, though they've since departed for the coast. It was a lie built on convenience. Such tragedies were common enough on the frontier that they rarely warranted investigation, and witnesses who had moved on to distant territories were impossible to track down." Hartwell nodded as if this explanation was perfectly reasonable. "The mortgage payments are current through the end of the year," he noted, "but there will be a significant sum due in January. Are you prepared to meet those obligations?" This was the question Margaret had been dreading. Thomas's hidden money would cover immediate needs, but wouldn't stretch to mortgage payments. She needed time, needed to find a way to generate income from the property or from her own skills. "I'm exploring several options," she said carefully. "The land is good for farming, and I understand there's demand for fresh produce in the mining camps to the north. I also have skills in sewing and teaching that might prove valuable." Hartwell raised an eyebrow. "Farming is difficult work for a woman, especially one caring for 7 children. The older boys are quite capable," Margaret replied, glancing at Daniel with genuine pride. "And I'm stronger than I look." Thomas often said that frontier life demanded adaptation from everyone, regardless of their previous circumstances. As if summoned by mention of his capabilities, Daniel looked up from his arithmetic. "Sir, would you like to see the improvements Pa made to the irrigation system?" He always said the water rights were the most valuable part of the property. It was a brilliant intervention, and Margaret felt a surge of affection for the boy's quick thinking. Hartwell seemed intrigued, and the three of them bundled into coats for a tour of the property that lasted nearly an hour. Daniel proved to be an excellent guide, pointing out the well Thomas had dug, the channels he had carved to direct creek water to the garden plots, the sturdy fencing that kept livestock from wandering. Margaret found herself genuinely impressed by the scope of Thomas Brennan's work. This had been more than a simple homestead. It was a carefully planned agricultural operation with real potential for growth. "Your father was quite the engineer," Hartwell commented to Daniel as they examined a wooden sluice gate that controlled water flow to different sections of the property. "Yes, sir. He always said water was more valuable than gold out here, and you had to treat it with respect." When they returned to the cabin, Hartwell's demeanor had noticeably warmed. He accepted another cup of coffee and spent time talking with the children, asking about their studies and their plans for the future. Emma charmed him with her knowledge of literature, while the twins demonstrated their proficiency with numbers by calculating the board feet of lumber in the barn walls. "Remarkable children," he told Margaret as he prepared to leave. "Well-educated and well-mannered. You're doing admirable work with them." "They're good children," Margaret replied simply. "They deserve every opportunity I can give them." Hartwell paused at the door, his expression thoughtful. "Mrs. Brennan, I'll be frank with you. This property has potential, but it will require significant investment and hard work to realize that potential. The bank has an interest in seeing it succeed, both financially and as an example of what can be accomplished on the frontier." He reached into his portfolio and withdrew a small card. "This is the name of a man in Helena who buys produce for the mining camps. He's always looking for reliable suppliers. And there's a widow in Millbrook, Mrs. Catherine Winters, who takes in sewing for the ladies in town. She might be able to put work your way." Margaret accepted the card with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Hartwell. This is more help than I had dared to hope for." "The bank will expect the January payment on schedule," he warned, but his tone was not unkind. "However, I'll make note in my report that this property shows promise under current management. That should buy you some flexibility if you need additional time to establish income sources." After the banker's carriage disappeared over the horizon, Margaret sank into Thomas's rocking chair and allowed herself a moment of relief. The first major test of their deception had been passed, but she knew there would be others. Sheriff Hawkins was still searching for the missing Brennan children, and sooner or later, someone would put together the pieces of their story. That evening, as the children celebrated their successful performance with extra portions of the apple pie Emma had learned to make from their mother's recipe, Margaret studied the card Hartwell had given her. Helena was a 3-day journey by wagon, but if she could establish a relationship with the produce buyer, it might provide the income that they desperately needed. "What are you thinking about, Mama?" Timothy asked, climbing onto her lap with the casual affection that never failed to surprise her. Margaret smiled and wrapped her arms around the small boy. In the past month, she had gone from lonely spinster to mother of 7, from homeless refugee to property owner, from Margaret Whitfield to Margaret Brennan. The transformation was so complete that sometimes she forgot she had ever been anyone else. "I'm thinking about spring," she told Timothy. "About planting gardens and maybe getting some more chickens. About teaching you all to read even better than you do now, and about keeping us safe?" Rebecca asked quietly from her seat by the fire, where she was mending a tear in Lucy's dress. Margaret looked around at the 7 faces, turned toward her with trust and love and the kind of hope that Children offered even in the darkest circumstances. "Yes," she said firmly, "most of all about keeping us safe." But even as she spoke the words, Margaret knew that safety was a luxury they couldn't take for granted. Winter was coming, bringing with it challenges that would test every skill she had learned and every resource they possessed. The sheriff's investigation was ongoing, and their carefully constructed identity could crumble under sustained scrutiny. Yet as she looked at Daniel helping Joseph with his reading, at Emma teaching Lucy to braid her hair, at Samuel and Timothy building elaborate structures with wooden blocks Thomas had carved, Margaret felt something she had never experienced before: the fierce, protective love of a mother willing to do anything to preserve her family. The wind rattled the windows and sent smoke curling back down the chimney, reminding them all that the prairie was never fully tamed, never completely safe. But inside the cabin, 7 children were learning to trust again, to hope again, to believe that home was a place where love mattered more than blood, where family was defined not by birth, but by choice. Margaret rocked Timothy until he fell asleep in her arms, then carried him to his bed and tucked the covers around his small form. One by one, she kissed each child goodnight, whispering the same words their father might have said: "Sleep well, little one. Tomorrow will bring new adventures, but tonight you are safe and loved." As she banked the fire and prepared for her own rest, Margaret thought about the woman who had stepped off that train in Millbrook barely a month ago. That woman had been seeking a husband, a conventional life, a prescribed role in someone else's story. Instead, she had found something far more challenging and infinitely more rewarding. She had found her purpose, her family, her true self. Future remained uncertain, filled with dangers and difficulties that would require every ounce of courage and cleverness she possessed. But Margaret Brennan was no longer the frightened mail-order bride who had arrived in Montana with nothing but desperate hope. She was a mother, a protector, a woman who had discovered that love could create family bonds stronger than any legal document or blood relation. And that knowledge gave her the strength to face whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. The first snow came early that year, falling like feathers from a sky the color of old pewter. Margaret woke to find the world transformed outside her window, the harsh browns and yellows of late autumn prairie, buried beneath a blanket of pristine white that stretched unbroken to the horizon. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. A reminder that winter in Montana Territory was not merely a season, but a test of endurance that claimed the unprepared without mercy. She dressed quickly in the pre-dawn darkness, layering Thomas's heavy wool shirt over her own clothing for warmth. The children were still sleeping, their breathing visible in small puffs of vapor that spoke of how cold the cabin had grown during the night. The fire had burned down to embers, and ice had formed in the water pitcher by the washstand. As Margaret rebuilt the fire and set coffee to boiling, she mentally reviewed their preparations for winter. The root cellar was well stocked with preserved vegetables and smoked meat, thanks to Daniel's success with the snares and Emma's skill at food preservation. They had cut and split enough firewood to last until Christmas, though they would need more before spring. The cabin had been chinked with mud and moss to keep out drafts, and Margaret had sewn heavy curtains from fabric salvaged from old dresses to help insulate the windows. But supplies and preparations were only part of the equation. Winter isolation meant they would be cut off from town for weeks or even months at a time, dependent entirely on their own resources and ingenuity. Any medical emergency, any serious injury, any problem they couldn't solve themselves could prove fatal. The children began stirring as the cabin warmed, emerging from their beds like hibernating creatures, reluctantly acknowledging the need to face another day. Timothy appeared first, padding across the cold floor in his stockings to climb into Margaret's lap while she stirred oatmeal at the stove. "It's snowing," he announced unnecessarily, pressing his face against the window. "Yes, sweetheart, winter's here." Emma joined them in the kitchen, automatically beginning to set the table for breakfast. At 11 years old, she had developed an intuitive understanding of household routines that sometimes startled Margaret with its sophistication. The girl moved with quiet efficiency, her blonde braids neat despite having just awakened, her movements economical and purposeful. "How deep do you think it is?" Emma asked, peering out at the accumulating snow. "Perhaps 6 inches," Margaret replied. "Enough to make travel difficult, but not impossible. Daniel will need to check the animals and make sure they have adequate shelter." Daniel appeared as if summoned, already dressed in his heaviest clothes, and carrying the lantern they used for early morning chores. At 13, he had grown taller and broader over the past month, his frame filling out with the improved nutrition and the confidence that came from having a secure home. But it was the responsibility in his eyes that marked him as older than his years, the weight of being the man of the family, even while still being a boy. "I'll clear a path to the barn and check the chicken coop," he said. "The horses should be fine, but the chickens don't like cold feet." Margaret smiled at this practical observation. Daniel had inherited his father's way with animals and his instinctive understanding of their needs. Under his care, their small livestock had not only survived but thrived, providing eggs, milk from the cow they had acquired in trade with a neighbor, and the promise of meat when necessary. The twins, Samuel and Joseph, emerged from their shared bed arguing quietly about who had stolen the covers during the night. Their latest growth spurt had left them all knees and elbows, constantly hungry and prone to mock battles that could escalate into real fights without warning. But they were also becoming genuinely helpful, able to handle many of the daily chores that kept the household functioning. Rebecca followed more slowly, her persistent cough worse in the cold air. Margaret had tried every remedy she knew: honey and lemon, steaming tents made from blankets, herbal teas brewed from plants. Emma had identified, but the cough lingered like an unwelcome guest. It worried Margaret more than she let on, especially with winter settling in and the nearest doctor a day's ride away under good conditions. Little Lucy was the last to appear, her dark hair tousled and her thumb firmly planted in her mouth. At 3 years old, she was the baby of the family, though her solemn eyes suggested she understood more about their precarious situation than anyone realized. She had attached herself to Margaret with the fierce devotion of a child who had learned that adults could disappear without warning. Breakfast was a simple affair: oatmeal with milk and honey, eggs from their chickens, coffee for Margaret, and milk for the children. But it was eaten in warmth and comfort, surrounded by the quiet chatter of a family beginning another day together. These moments of ordinary domesticity had become precious to Margaret, reminders that they had created something real and lasting. Despite the unusual circumstances of their union. After breakfast, while the children began their daily lessons, Margaret sat down to work on the sewing that Mrs. Catherine Winters had sent from town. The banker's referral had proven invaluable. Catherine was a widow herself, struggling to support 3 children through her needlework, and she had welcomed Margaret's skilled assistance. The work was painstaking, hemming fine dresses for the banker's wife, mending tiers and shirts for the local ranchers, creating simple garments for children whose mothers lacked the time or skill for sewing. Each piece brought in a few coins, but more importantly, it established Margaret's reputation as a reliable seamstress and connected her to the network of women who formed the social backbone of frontier communities. Through Catherine, she learned which families were struggling, which men were looking for work, which opportunities might arise for someone willing to take risks. The morning passed peacefully until Daniel burst through the door with news that sent ice through Margaret's veins. "Riders coming," he announced breathlessly. 3 of them, maybe 4. Still about a mile out, but heading straight this way. Margaret's hands stilled on her sewing as her mind raced through possibilities. The banker had no reason to return so soon. Neighbors rarely traveled in groups, especially in winter weather. That left official visitors, sheriff's deputies, federal marshals, or other authorities who might be investigating the mysterious disappearance of 7 children. "Emma, gather the little ones upstairs," Margaret instructed, her voice calm despite the panic clawing at her chest. "Stay quiet and away from the windows. Daniel, bank the fire and put away anything that looks like we're settled here permanently. We need this place to look like a temporary stop, not a permanent home." The children moved with practiced efficiency, their earlier rehearsals paying off in smooth execution. Books disappeared into trunks. Extra bedding was bundled out of sight. Personal belongings vanished into hiding places they had prepared for exactly this moment. Within minutes, the cabin had been transformed from a family home into the temporary shelter of a widow. Traveling with visiting relatives, Margaret changed quickly into her best black dress, the one she had worn to meet Thomas Brennan at the train station. The morning attire was both appropriate for her supposed status and subtly discouraging to casual conversation. She pinched her cheeks to bring color to her face and practiced the composed expression of a woman managing difficult circumstances. With quiet dignity, the riders approached slowly, their horses picking their way carefully through the deepening snow. Margaret watched from behind the curtain as they drew near, her heart sinking as she recognized the lead figure. Sheriff Hawkins sat tall in his saddle, his weathered face grim with purpose. Behind him rode 2 deputies she didn't recognize and a 4th man whose expensive coat and city shoes marked him as an outsider. They reined in at the front gate, and Hawkins dismounted with the stiff movements of a man who had been riding in cold weather. He approached the door with the measured pace of someone performing an unpleasant duty, his hand resting casually on the butt of his revolver. Margaret opened the door before he could knock, projecting the mild surprise of someone interrupted in their daily routine. "Sheriff Hawkins, isn't it? What brings you out in this weather?" "Mrs. Brennan." Hawkins touched the brim of his hat with formal courtesy. "Sorry to trouble you, ma'am, but I'm afraid we have some questions that need answering." "Of course. Please, come in out of the cold. I was just preparing lunch. You're welcome to share what we have." The invitation was both genuine hospitality and strategic maneuvering. Breaking bread together would establish a more informal atmosphere, and feeding the men would position Margaret as a gracious hostess rather than a suspicious person of interest. Hawkins accepted gratefully, stamping snow from his boots before entering. His deputies followed, along with the city man who introduced himself as Federal Marshal James Richardson from Helena. Margaret's blood chilled at the federal involvement, but she maintained her composure as she bustled about preparing food and coffee for her unexpected guests. "Fine property you have here," Richardson observed, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of the cabin's interior. "Your late husband did well for himself." "Thomas was a good provider," Margaret agreed, ladling soup into bowls with steady hands. "He worked very hard to build something lasting here." "Must be difficult, managing all this alone," Hawkins said, accepting a steaming bowl with obvious appreciation. "Especially with all those children to look after." There it was, the opening Margaret had been dreading. She sat down across from the men, her own soup cooling untouched as she prepared to defend the life they had built. "The children are a blessing," she said simply. "Thomas's nieces and nephews from Ohio. They arrived just before he passed. Poor things. Their parents died in a typhoid outbreak, and Thomas was their only living relative." Richardson consulted a small notebook, his movements precise and deliberate. 7 children, ranging in age from 3 to 13. That's quite a responsibility for a woman on her own. "Family is family," Margaret replied. "These children have lost everything. I couldn't bear to see them separated and sent to strangers when they have each other." "Noble sentiment," Hawkins acknowledged, though his tone suggested skepticism. "But we're actually here about a different matter. You see, Thomas Brennan had 7 children of his own who seemed to have vanished after his death. Same ages, same number. Quite a coincidence." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to look puzzled rather than panicked. "I'm afraid I don't understand, Sheriff. Thomas never mentioned having children of his own." "Are you certain we're talking about the same Thomas Brennan?" Richardson leaned forward, his expression intent. "How long were you married to Mr. Brennan?" "Ma'am, 3 days," Margaret said softly, allowing pain to color her voice. "We were wed by a traveling preacher just before Thomas took ill. It was his dying wish that we marry so I could help care for the children legally." "This preacher have a name?" Hawkins asked. "Reverend Michaels." "He and his wife were traveling to establish a new congregation in California. Tragic what happened to them." Richardson made notes in his book. "And you say Mr. Brennan never mentioned having children of his own?" Margaret shook her head, projecting the confusion of someone hearing disturbing news about a loved one. "Never. I can't imagine why he would hide such a thing, especially from someone he trusted to care for his nieces and nephews." The conversation continued for another hour, with the men asking detailed questions about her background, her relationship with Thomas, her plans for the property. Margaret answered honestly when possible and lied convincingly when necessary, drawing on every acting skill she had ever observed in others. Finally, Richardson closed his notebook and exchanged glances with Hawkins. "We'd like to speak with the children, if that's possible, just to confirm their identities and ensure they're being properly cared for." This was the moment Margaret had most feared. Upstairs, 7 children who had been coached to lie about their identities waited to perform the most important roles of their young lives. Everything they had built together depended on their ability to convince trained investigators that they were someone other than who they actually were. "Of course," Margaret said graciously. "Though I should warn you, they're still grieving for their parents and quite shy around strangers. The little ones especially have been through such trauma." She called up the stairs, and after a few moments, the children began to descend. Emma came first, her blonde hair neatly braided and her expression appropriately solemn. She had coached the others well, and they appeared one by one like actors taking the stage. Daniel with his shoulders squared and his eyes direct, the twins staying close together for mutual support, Rebecca fighting to suppress her cough, Timothy clutching Lucy's hand as they faced the strange men. What followed was a masterpiece of childhood deception. The children answered questions about their supposed hometown in Ohio, their deceased parents, their journey west to live with Uncle Thomas. They spoke of missing their old home while being grateful for Aunt Margaret's kindness. They recited memorized details about a life they had never lived with the conviction of method actors who had fully inhabited their roles. Emma was particularly brilliant, speaking with the careful diction of a girl who had been well educated before tragedy struck her family. She mentioned specific streets in Cincinnati, teachers who had been kind to her, friends she missed terribly. The details were so convincing that Margaret almost believed them herself. Daniel played his part as the responsible older brother, protective of his younger siblings and grateful for the security Margaret provided. When Richardson asked about his plans for the future, he spoke earnestly about learning farming techniques and perhaps studying law, someday to help other families in difficult circumstances. Even little Lucy performed flawlessly, hiding shyly behind Margaret's skirts when questioned directly, but nodding solemnly when asked if she liked living with her new aunt. Timothy demonstrated his arithmetic skills by counting to 20 and reciting the alphabet, proving that Margaret was indeed providing proper education for her charges. The investigators found no flaws in the children's stories, no inconsistencies that would suggest deception. After 2 hours of questioning, Richardson finally stood and thanked Margaret for her cooperation. "You're doing admirable work here, Mrs. Brennan," he said as the men prepared to leave. 7 children is a tremendous responsibility, especially under such tragic circumstances. "They're good children," Margaret replied simply. "They deserve every opportunity I can give them." Hawkins paused at the door, his weathered face thoughtful. "Ma'am, if you happen to hear anything about those missing Brennan children, anything at all, I'd appreciate you letting me know. Those youngsters are somewhere out there in this weather, and every day that passes makes their situation more dangerous." Margaret nodded gravely. "Of course, Sheriff. I can't imagine what those poor children are going through. I'll certainly keep my ears open." After the men rode away, their figures disappearing into the swirling snow, Margaret collapsed into Thomas's rocking chair and allowed herself to shake with the release of tension she had been suppressing. The children gathered around her, their own relief evident in their faces and posture. "Did we do good, Mama?" Timothy asked, climbing into her lap with the easy affection that never failed to move her. "You were perfect," Margaret whispered, gathering him close and reaching out to embrace the others. "All of you. I'm so proud of how brave you were." But even as she celebrated their successful deception, Margaret knew they were not safe. The investigation would continue, and other tests would come. Winter was settling in around them like a siege, and they would need every skill, every resource, every ounce of courage they possessed to survive, until spring. Yet as she looked at the 7 faces turned toward her with love and trust, Margaret felt the fierce determination that had become her defining characteristic. These children were her family now, chosen rather than born, but no less precious for that choice. She had found her purpose in protecting them, and she would let nothing and no one tear apart what they had built together. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering their tracks and erasing evidence of the day's events. But inside the cabin, 7 children settled back into their routines, secure in the knowledge that their mother would keep them safe no matter what storms lay ahead. The blizzard struck 3 days before, Christmas with the fury of something personal and vindictive. Margaret woke to a world erased by white, where the familiar landmarks of their homestead had vanished beneath drifts that reached the cabin's windows. The wind howled like a living thing in pain, driving snow horizontally across the prairie, and making it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. She had experienced winter storms in Philadelphia, but they were civilized affairs compared to this raw display of nature's power. Here, winter was not merely weather but an adversary that could kill the unprepared without remorse. The temperature had plummeted so far that the water in their wash basin had frozen solid overnight, and frost covered the inside walls of the cabin despite the fire burning constantly in the hearth. Daniel struggled to reach the barn through snow that came up to his chest. Following a rope Margaret had insisted they string between the buildings. After hearing horror stories of people becoming lost and freezing to death mere yards from safety, he returned an hour later, his face red with cold and his eyebrows white with accumulated ice. "Animals are scared, but all right," he reported, stamping his feet to restore circulation. "Chickens are huddled together in their roost, and the cows got enough hay to last a few days. But we're going to need to dig out the barn door if this keeps up much longer." Margaret nodded grimly as she helped him out of his snow-caked coat. They had prepared as well as they could for winter, but no amount of preparation could account for a storm of this magnitude. If it continued much longer, they would be completely cut off from the outside world, dependent entirely on their stored supplies and their ability to keep the fires burning. The children sensed the gravity of their situation without being told. Emma took charge of the younger ones with quiet efficiency, organizing games and activities to keep them occupied while Margaret and Daniel assessed their resources. The twins worked together to maintain the fire, feeding it carefully measured amounts of wood to ensure steady heat without depleting their supply too quickly. Rebecca's cough had worsened in the cold, harsh air, and Margaret was growing increasingly concerned about the child's health. She brewed endless pots of herbal tea, created steam tents from blankets draped over chairs, and tried every remedy she could remember or improvise. But the cough persisted, sometimes keeping the entire household awake with its harsh, rasping sound. Little Timothy had developed an intense fear of the storm, convinced that the wind was trying to break into the cabin and steal them away. He clung to Margaret with desperate intensity, whimpering at particularly violent gusts and refusing to let her out of his sight. Lucy, always sensitive to the emotions of others, picked up on his anxiety and began having nightmares that left her crying and inconsolable in the dark hours before dawn. By the second day of the blizzard, the situation had become critical. Snow had drifted against the cabin door to a depth of nearly 4 feet, and they were essentially trapped inside. The temperature continued to drop, and even with the fire burning constantly, ice began forming in the corners of the main room. Farthest from the hearth, Margaret rationed their food supplies with military precision, serving smaller portions and stretching ingredients with creative combinations that kept bellies reasonably full while preserving their stores. Breakfast became thin porridge with just a touch of honey. Lunch was weak soup made from bones and scraps, thickened with whatever vegetables remained in their stores. Dinner was slightly more substantial, but still carefully measured to make their supplies last as long as possible. The children accepted these hardships without complaint, understanding instinctively that their survival depended on working together and making sacrifices. Emma helped stretch their flour by learning to make bread with less yeast and more creativity. Daniel fashioned snowshoes from wooden planks and rope, preparing for the day when he might need to venture out for firewood or supplies. On the third day, disaster struck in the form Margaret had most dreaded. Rebecca's cough suddenly worsened, accompanied by a fever that left the 6-year-old delirious and struggling to breathe. Margaret recognized the signs of pneumonia, a condition that killed children regularly on the frontier, where medical care was scarce and often ineffective. She moved Rebecca to the warmest spot in the cabin, directly in front of the fire, and began a desperate campaign to break the fever and clear the child's lungs. Steam treatments became hourly rituals, with Margaret holding the sick girl over pots of boiling water infused with whatever medicinal plants she could find in their stores. She brewed teas from willow bark for the fever, made poultices from mustard seed for the chest congestion, and prayed with an intensity that surprised her with its fervor. The other children watched with the wide-eyed fear of those who understood that death was a frequent visitor to frontier families. They had already lost their parents and been abandoned by the world at large. The possibility of losing Rebecca, their gentle, quiet sister who somehow managed to be wise beyond her years, was almost too terrible to contemplate. Daniel appointed himself nurse, helping Margaret with the endless treatments and taking turns sitting up through the night to monitor Rebecca's breathing. Emma organized the younger children, keeping them occupied and quiet so Rebecca could rest. Even little Lucy seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, bringing her favorite rag doll to place beside her sick sister and whispering earnest prayers in the childish belief that God paid special attention to the requests of 3-year-olds. Fever raged for 2 days and nights, during which Margaret barely slept or ate. She moved through the cabin like a woman possessed, brewing medicines, applying treatments, and maintaining a vigil that felt like holding back death through sheer force of will. Rebecca drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes calling for her mother, sometimes fighting weakly against the ministrations meant to help her. On the second night of the crisis, as the blizzard continued to rage outside and the fever reached its peak, Margaret found herself alone with the sick child while the others finally succumbed to exhausted sleep. She sat beside Rebecca's makeshift bed, holding the girl's burning hand and listening to her labored breathing, wondering if she was about to lose the first of her children to the harsh realities of frontier life. It was then that Rebecca opened her eyes with sudden clarity, her fever-bright gaze focusing on Margaret's face with surprising intensity. "Mama," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Are you really our mama now?" The question struck Margaret like a physical blow. In all their careful rehearsals and practiced deceptions, they had created elaborate stories about being visiting relatives, about Margaret being their aunt by marriage. But here, in the honest vulnerability of serious illness, Rebecca was asking about something deeper and more fundamental. "Yes, sweetheart," Margaret whispered back, tears streaming down her face. "I'm your mama now, and I'll always be your mama, no matter what happens." Rebecca smiled then, a weak but genuine expression that transformed her feverish features. "I knew," she said simply. "I could tell by the way you worry about us. Real mamas worry like that." The fever broke that night, as suddenly and dramatically as it had arrived. Margaret woke from a brief doze to find Rebecca's forehead cool and damp with healing perspiration, her breathing deep and regular for the first time in days. The crisis had passed, leaving them all emotionally drained but profoundly grateful for the reprieve. The blizzard finally exhausted itself on Christmas Eve, leaving behind a world sculpted in white and a silence so profound it seemed to ring in their ears. Margaret opened the cabin door to find snowdrifts that reached nearly to the roofline in some places, transforming their familiar homestead into an alien landscape of curves and shadows. But they survived. All of them. They were alive and together, and safe in their small fortress against the world. As Margaret looked out at the pristine beauty of the snow-covered prairie, she felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond mere survival. They had faced their first major test as a family and emerged stronger for the experience. Christmas Day dawned clear and brutally cold, with air so sharp it seemed to cut the lungs and a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. Margaret had prepared small gifts for the children, mittens knitted from unraveled wool, simple toys carved by Daniel from scraps of wood, hair ribbons sewn from fabric remnants. The presents were modest by any standard, but they represented something precious, the normal rhythms of family life continuing despite extraordinary circumstances. Emma had managed to bake a cake using their carefully hoarded supplies, and Daniel had surprised everyone by producing a small bottle of maple syrup he had been saving since autumn. Timothy and Lucy built an elaborate snow fort in the drifts outside the cabin, their laughter carrying across the white expanse like music. But it was Rebecca's gift to Margaret that brought tears to everyone's eyes. The 6-year-old had spent weeks secretly working on a sampler, stitching words in careful, childish letters. "Home is where Mama is." The simple sentiment, worked in red thread on rough brown cloth, became Margaret's most treasured possession. As they sat around the fire that evening, sharing stories and singing the carols Margaret remembered from her childhood, she realized that this Christmas was unlike any she had ever experienced. There were no elaborate decorations, no expensive gifts, no formal church services or grand dinners. But there was something more valuable than any of those traditional trappings, the deep contentment that came from being exactly where she belonged, with people who needed her as much as she needed them. The weeks following Christmas brought new challenges as their food supplies dwindled and the brutal cold continued. Margaret rationed their remaining stores with mathematical precision, calculating how much they could consume each day while still maintaining adequate nutrition for growing children. The game Daniel caught in his snares became increasingly important to their survival, and Margaret learned to prepare rabbit and prairie birds in ways that stretched the meat as far as possible. Emma proved invaluable during this period, demonstrating a natural talent for making something appetizing from the most basic ingredients. She could turn a few potatoes, some dried herbs, and a small piece of meat into a stew that tasted like abundance rather than scarcity. Her bread, while dense and heavy by conventional standards, provided sustenance and comfort during the darkest days of winter. The twins developed their own contributions to the family's survival, becoming expert at finding and processing fuel for their fires. They learned to identify which types of dried grass burned hottest, how to prepare buffalo chips they found buried under the snow, and where to locate deadfall wood that could be chopped into manageable pieces. Little Timothy surprised everyone by revealing a talent for storytelling. entertaining his siblings during the long winter evenings with elaborate tales of adventure and heroism. His stories often featured brave children who overcame impossible odds through cleverness and cooperation, and Margaret recognized that he was processing their own experiences through the safe medium of fiction. Lucy, the baby of the family, seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of when comfort was needed most. She would climb into someone's lap at exactly the right moment, offer her favorite doll to whoever seemed saddest, or simply stand close by when words weren't adequate to. The situation. As January deepened into February, Margaret began to worry about their long-term prospects. Their food supplies were critically low despite careful rationing, and the mortgage payment loomed like a sword hanging over their heads. She had the money Thomas had hidden, but using it for the mortgage would leave them with nothing for emergencies or spring planting. It was during this period of uncertainty that help arrived from an unexpected source. Margaret was teaching the children their daily lessons when she spotted a familiar figure approaching through the snow. Mrs. Catherine Winters, the widow who had been sending sewing work Margaret's way, was trudging across the prairie on snowshoes, pulling a small sled loaded with supplies. Catherine was a woman of perhaps 40, with steel-gray hair and the kind of practical competence that frontier life demanded. She had lost her husband to a mining accident 3 years earlier and had been supporting her 3 children through sewing, baking, and sheer determination ever since. She and Margaret had developed a friendship based on mutual respect and the shared understanding of what it meant to be a woman alone in a harsh world. "Thought you might be running low on supplies," Catherine announced without preamble as she stamped snow from her boots. "Brought some basics and figured we could work out a trade arrangement." The supplies she had brought were modest but carefully chosen: flour, beans, coffee, and some preserved meat. More importantly, she had brought news from town and a proposal that could solve Margaret's immediate financial problems. "There's a group of mining families up north who need someone to teach their children," Catherine explained as they shared coffee and discussed business. "Pays not much, but it's regular, and they're desperate enough to overlook the fact that you're a woman alone with a house full of children." The opportunity was tempting but complicated. Taking on students would bring in much-needed income, but it would also mean additional exposure to scrutiny. More people knowing their story meant more chances for someone to spot inconsistencies or ask uncomfortable questions. "How many children?" Margaret asked, already calculating how to manage additional students alongside her own 7. "About 15, ranging from 6 to 14 years old. Their parents are good people, but they're working claims that keep them away from home for long stretches. They need someone who can provide proper education and maybe some guidance on practical matters." Margaret considered the proposal carefully. The income would be enough to make the mortgage payment and buy supplies for spring planting. More importantly, it would establish her as a legitimate member of the community, someone providing valuable services rather than simply existing on the margins of frontier society. "I'll need to bring some of my own children as assistants," she said finally. "Emma's quite capable with the younger students, and Daniel could help with outdoor activities and practical skills." Catherine nodded approvingly. "That would actually be an advantage. These mining families want their children to learn more than just reading and arithmetic. They need practical skills for frontier life, and your young ones could demonstrate everything from farming techniques to household management." They spent the rest of the afternoon working out details and logistics. Margaret would travel to the mining settlement 3 days a week, bringing Emma and Daniel as assistants, while leaving the younger children in the care of Samuel and Joseph, who at 8 years old were responsible enough to manage basic household tasks for short periods. As Catherine prepared to leave, she pulled Margaret aside for a private conversation. "I don't know what your story really is," she said quietly, "and I don't need to know. But I recognize a woman trying to build a life from difficult circumstances when I see one. You're doing good work with those children, whoever they really are." Margaret felt her heart stop as the implications of Catherine's words sank in. Had their deception been discovered? Were they in danger of exposure? Catherine must have read the panic in her expression because she smiled reassuringly. "Don't worry. Your secrets are safe with me. I've got my own reasons for not asking too many questions about the past. Out here, what matters is what you do today and tomorrow, not where you came from or what brought you here." That evening, as Margaret shared the news of their new opportunity with the children, she reflected on the unexpected forms that salvation could take. They had survived the winter's worst storms. Rebecca had recovered from her brush with pneumonia, and now they had a path forward that could provide both income and legitimacy. But perhaps most importantly, they had discovered something that no amount of money or official recognition could provide. They had learned that they were truly a family, bound together not by blood or legal documents, but by choice, love, and shared determination to build something lasting from the ruins of their individual tragedies. The frontier was still harsh and unforgiving, full of dangers that could destroy everything they had worked to build. But Margaret no longer faced those challenges as a desperate woman with no resources except hope. She faced them as a mother, a teacher, a member of a community that valued her contributions. And that transformation from Margaret Whitfield, the failed mail-order bride, to Margaret Brennan, the frontier mother and educator, was worth every hardship they had endured and every challenge that lay ahead. Spring arrived like a miracle, disguised as mud and chaos. The snow melted in rushing torrents that turned the prairie into a vast swamp, filled the creek beds to overflowing, and transformed their carefully maintained homestead into a landscape of sucking earth and standing water. But to Margaret and the children who had survived the brutal winter locked in their cabin for months, the muddy mess was beautiful beyond description. It meant freedom, renewal, and the promise that they had successfully weathered their first year as a family. Margaret stood on the front porch in the early April morning, breathing air that finally carried the scent of growing things instead of the sharp bite of snow and ice. The children were scattered across the yard like puppies released from confinement, their voices bright with laughter as they rediscovered a world beyond the cabin walls. Timothy and Lucy were building elaborate dams in the temporary streams created by snowmelt, while the twins competed to see who could throw rocks the farthest into the swollen creek. Emma and Rebecca worked together in what would become their kitchen garden, carefully planting seeds they had saved from last year's harvest and new varieties Margaret had purchased with income from her teaching work. Daniel was examining the barn, assessing winter damage and planning repairs with the methodical approach he had inherited from his father. The teaching arrangement had proven more successful than Margaret had dared hope. 3 days a week throughout the winter, she had made the difficult journey to the mining settlement with Emma and Daniel as her assistants, providing education for 15 children whose parents worked claims in the surrounding hills. The income was modest but steady, and, more importantly, it had established Margaret's reputation as a valuable member of the broader community. The miners' children had presented unique challenges and rewards. Many had never attended formal school, instead learning whatever their parents could teach between shifts underground. They were eager for knowledge but impatient with theoretical lessons that seemed irrelevant to their daily lives. Margaret had adapted by incorporating practical skills into every subject, teaching mathematics through carpentry projects, geography through mining techniques, literature through stories of frontier adventure. Emma had revealed a natural gift for working with younger children, possessing the patience and creativity needed to make learning enjoyable for students who might otherwise resist education. She developed games that taught spelling and arithmetic, organized dramatic presentations of historical events, and somehow managed to maintain order among children who were accustomed to running wild during their parents' long absences. Daniel proved equally valuable, though in different ways. The older boys in the settlement had initially been skeptical of taking instruction from someone barely older than themselves, But Daniel's practical knowledge and quiet competence quickly won their respect. He taught them to set snares, read weather signs, identify edible plants, and dozens of other skills that could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe on the frontier. More importantly for Margaret's peace of mind, the teaching work had created a network of relationships that provided both protection and legitimacy for their unusual family situation. The mining families accepted without question that Margaret was Thomas Brennan's widow, caring for his orphaned nieces and nephews while supporting herself through education work. Their story had become part of local folklore, the tragic tale of a mail-order bride who arrived just in time to save 7 children from disaster. But Margaret knew their security remained fragile. Sheriff Hawkins had never fully accepted their explanation for the missing Brennan children, and federal interest in the case had not entirely disappeared. They lived under constant threat of discovery, knowing that one slip, one inconsistency in their carefully maintained fiction, could destroy everything they had built. That threat materialized on a warm morning in late April when Margaret spotted a familiar figure approaching the homestead. Judge Harrison Caldwell rode a fine black horse and wore the kind of formal clothing that marked him as a man of authority and influence. Margaret had heard his name mentioned in town. He was the federal judge responsible for territorial legal matters, including custody disputes and property claims. Her heart hammered as she quickly called the children inside, reminding them with sharp efficiency to remember their roles and their story. But even as they prepared for what might be their final test, Margaret felt a strange calm settling over her. They had survived winter, illness, investigation, and countless smaller challenges. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Judge Caldwell dismounted with the careful movements of a man no longer young, his gray beard neatly trimmed and his manner suggesting someone accustomed to having his words carry weight. He approached the cabin with formal courtesy, removing his hat as Margaret appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Brennan, I presume? I am Judge Harrison Caldwell. I wonder if I might have a word with you regarding a legal matter of some importance." Margaret invited him inside with the gracious hospitality that had become second nature, preparing coffee and arranging chairs near the window where the morning light would illuminate their conversation. The children gathered quietly in the background, not hiding but not calling attention to themselves, their presence a subtle reminder of what was at stake. "I'll come directly to the point," Judge Caldwell began as he accepted a cup of coffee. "I've been reviewing the case of the missing Brennan children, and I find myself puzzled by certain inconsistencies in the available evidence." Margaret kept her expression neutral despite the ice forming in her stomach. "I'm not sure how I can help with that, Your Honor. As I've explained to Sheriff Hawkins, my late husband never mentioned having children of his own." "Indeed, and that's precisely what troubles me." Caldwell consulted a leather folder he carried. "You see, I've been in correspondence with officials in Ohio regarding the typhoid outbreak that supposedly killed the parents of these children you're caring for. The curious thing is, there's no record of such an outbreak in any of the communities where you claim these children originated." The silence that followed was profound. Margaret felt the weight of 7 pairs of eyes watching her, waiting to see how she would respond to this revelation, that their carefully constructed story was crumbling. But rather than panic, she felt an unexpected sense of relief. The burden of deception had grown heavier over the months, and part of her was almost grateful that the time for truth had finally arrived. "Furthermore," Caldwell continued, "I've discovered some interesting information about Thomas Brennan's background. It seems he was indeed a widower, but not recently. His wife died in childbirth 7 years ago, along with their infant daughter. The neighbors I've spoken with remember him mentioning the birth of subsequent children, though none ever saw them directly." Margaret set down her coffee cup with steady hands, her mind racing through options and outcomes. Beside her, Daniel shifted slightly, ready to defend his family however necessary. Emma moved protectively closer to the younger children, her face pale but determined. "The question that intrigues me," Caldwell said quietly, "is what became of those children after their father's death? Were they perhaps hidden by someone who cared more about keeping them together than about following legal procedures? Someone who understood that the law, while necessary, doesn't always serve the best interests of children who have already lost everything?" Margaret looked directly into the judge's eyes, searching for clues about his intentions. What she saw there surprised her, not accusation or condemnation, but something that might have been understanding, even approval. "Hypothetically speaking," she said carefully, "if such a person existed, and if those children were safe, well cared for, and genuinely happy in their current situation, what would your legal obligation require you to do?" Caldwell smiled then, an expression that transformed his austere features and revealed the humanity beneath his judicial robes. "That's a complex question, Mrs. Brennan. The law requires that abandoned children be placed in appropriate care through proper legal channels. However, the law also recognizes that children's welfare must be the primary consideration in any custody determination." He stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the homestead where children's voices could be heard planning the day's adventures. "What I see here is a woman who has taken 7 children who might otherwise have been separated and shipped to various institutions, and given them a home, an education, and most importantly, the security of remaining together as a family. That strikes me as serving the law's highest purpose, even if it circumvents some of its procedures." Margaret felt tears beginning to form, but forced herself to remain composed. "And what do you intend to do with these observations, Your Honor?" "That depends," Caldwell replied, turning back to face her. "Are you prepared to make this arrangement legal and permanent? I have the authority to approve emergency custody arrangements, and I believe I could be persuaded that the circumstances here warrant such action." The room fell silent, except for the sound of Margaret's heart beating so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. After months of living in fear of discovery, of having their family torn apart by legal technicalities, salvation was being offered by the very system they had been hiding from. "There would be conditions," Caldwell continued. "You would need to formally adopt all 7 children, establishing legal guardianship that no one could challenge. You would need to demonstrate stable income and appropriate living conditions. And you would need to ensure that all the children receive proper education and preparation for productive adult lives." "I accept," Margaret said immediately, then caught herself. "That is, if the children agree. They should have a voice in this decision." What followed was a family conference unlike any they had held before. For the first time since their deception began, they could speak openly about their real identities, their true relationships, and their genuine feelings about their life together. One by one, the children affirmed that they wanted Margaret to be their legal mother, that they considered each other true siblings regardless of blood relationships, and that they wanted to remain together as a family. Daniel, as the oldest, spoke for all of them when he said, "We were lost when Pa died. Margaret found us and made us a family again. We don't want any other life than the one we have here." The legal process took several weeks to complete, during which Judge Caldwell proved to be an unexpected ally and friend. He helped navigate the territorial bureaucracy, ensuring that all documents were properly filed and all requirements met. He even arranged for a formal hearing where character witnesses testified to Margaret's fitness as a mother and the children's happiness in her care. Catherine Winters spoke eloquently about Margaret's contributions to the community through her teaching work. Samuel Morrison from the general store testified to her responsible management of the homestead and her fair dealing in business matters. Even the banker, Charles Hartwell, provided positive testimony about her efforts to maintain and improve the property, but it was the children themselves who provided the most compelling evidence. Their obvious affection for Margaret, their academic progress under her guidance, and their mature understanding of their circumstances impressed everyone present. When little Lucy spontaneously climbed into Margaret's lap during the hearing and announced that Mama Margaret makes the best pancakes in the whole world, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. The final decree was signed on a brilliant day. In May, when the prairie was green with new grass and wildflowers painted the landscape in shades of purple and gold, Margaret held the official document that made her the legal mother of Daniel, Emma, Samuel, Joseph, Rebecca, Timothy, and Lucy Brennan, and felt a sense of completion that went beyond mere paperwork. They celebrated that evening with a feast that used up most of their carefully hoarded supplies: fresh bread, butter churned from their cow's cream, vegetables from their garden, and even a cake that Emma had somehow managed to create using precious sugar, purchased especially for the occasion. As they sat around the table that had witnessed so many meals of scarcity and uncertainty, Margaret marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. She thought of the terrified woman who had stepped off the train in Millbrook nearly a year ago, seeking a husband and a conventional life. That woman could never have imagined the path that lay ahead, the deception and danger, the hardships and heartbreak, the gradual transformation from desperate stranger to beloved mother. But she also thought of Thomas Brennan, the man she had never met, but who had shaped their destiny through his letters and his love for his children. His dream of keeping his family together had been realized, though not in any way he could have foreseen. His children were safe, educated, and deeply loved by a woman who had discovered her true calling in caring for them. As summer progressed, their life settled into rhythms that felt both familiar and miraculous. Margaret continued her teaching work, now expanded to include a summer school for children from neighboring homesteads. The income allowed them to make improvements to the property: a new roof for the barn, additional rooms added to the cabin, and the purchase of livestock that would provide both food and potential income. Daniel grew into his role as the man of the family, though he remained very much a boy in his eagerness to explore and learn. He showed remarkable aptitude for both farming and mechanical work, often surprising adults with his innovative solutions to practical problems. Emma developed into a gifted teacher in her own right, working alongside Margaret with such skill that several families requested her specifically for their children's instruction. The twins, Samuel and Joseph, discovered individual talents that had been overshadowed by their identical appearance. Samuel showed artistic ability, creating detailed drawings of plants and animals that amazed everyone with their accuracy and beauty. Joseph proved to have a gift for music, fashioning instruments from whatever materials he could find and composing simple melodies that became family favorites. Rebecca recovered completely from her winter illness and blossomed into a gentle, thoughtful child whose quiet wisdom often surprised adults. She developed a special relationship with injured animals, somehow knowing exactly how to care for creatures that others might give up as lost causes. Timothy's storytelling talents evolved into a genuine gift for entertainment, and his elaborate tales became popular with children throughout the district. Little Lucy remained the baby of the family, though she grew more confident and outgoing as she felt increasingly secure in her place. She had no memory of their early hardships and accepted their current life as simply the natural order of things, a household where love was abundant, education was prized, and every member contributed according to their abilities. As autumn approached, bringing with it their second winter as a family, Margaret reflected on the miraculous transformation of their circumstances. They were no longer refugees hiding from the law, but respected members of their community. They were no longer strangers thrown together by desperation, but a genuine family bound by choice and deepened by shared experience. The mail-order bride, who had come west seeking a husband, had instead found something far more valuable. She had found her purpose, her calling, and her true self. In saving 7 children from separation and institutional care, she had saved herself from a life of emptiness and regret. Their story had become legend in the territory, the tale of the woman who arrived as a mail-order bride but stayed to become the mother a family desperately needed. But Margaret knew the real story was simpler and more profound than any legend. It was the story of love creating a family where none had existed before, of courage triumphing over impossible circumstances, and of the truth that sometimes the best families are not born, but chosen. As she tucked each child into bed that night, listening to their prayers of gratitude for their home, their family, and their future, Margaret whispered her own prayer of thanksgiving. She had come to Montana Territory seeking one life and found another entirely, one richer, more challenging, and more rewarding than anything she could have imagined. Outside, the prairie wind sang its eternal song across the vast landscape, carrying with it the promise of seasons yet to come, challenges yet to face, and joys yet to discover. But inside the cabin that had become their fortress against the world, 8 people who had been strangers were now family, bound together by something stronger than blood or law or convention. They were bound by love, and that was enough to face whatever the future might bring. Years flowed like the creek that ran behind their homestead, sometimes rushing with the urgency of spring floods, sometimes moving quietly through the peaceful pools of ordinary days. Margaret watched her children grow from the frightened, half-starved waifs she had discovered in a root cellar, into confident young adults who carried themselves with the dignity of people who knew they were loved unconditionally. Daniel reached his 18th birthday in the spring of their 4th year together, tall and broad-shouldered like his father, but with a gentleness in his manner that spoke of Margaret's influence. He had developed into a natural leader, not through force or bluster, but through the quiet competence that made others turn to him for guidance. The neighboring homesteaders often sought his advice on farming techniques, water management, and the 100 small problems that arose in frontier life. When the territorial legislature began discussing statehood for Montana, Daniel surprised everyone by announcing his intention to study law. There are going to be new laws, new courts, new ways of doing things, he explained to Margaret as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. Somebody needs to make sure those laws protect families like ours, families that don't fit the usual patterns, but deserve the same rights and protections. Margaret felt a surge of pride so intense it left her breathless. The boy who had once hidden in terror from legal authorities now wanted to become part of the system that governed their territory. It was a transformation that spoke to the healing power of security and unconditional love. Emma, now 15, had blossomed into a young woman whose intelligence and compassion made her a natural teacher. She had formally taken over much of the instruction at the mining settlement, freeing Margaret to expand their teaching operation to include children from homesteads as far as 20 miles away. Parents were willing to send their children considerable distances for the education the Brennan family provided, recognizing that learning practical skills alongside traditional academics gave their offspring advantages unavailable elsewhere. But Emma's greatest gift was her ability to see potential in students others might dismiss as hopeless. She worked patiently with children who struggled with letters and numbers, finding creative ways to unlock understanding that had been blocked by conventional teaching methods. Her success with a young boy who had been considered mentally deficient, until Emma discovered he could solve complex mathematical problems if they were presented as visual puzzles, had earned her a reputation that extended far beyond their immediate community. The twins, Samuel and Joseph, had grown into their individual identities while maintaining the special bond that marked them as two halves of a whole. Samuel's artistic talents had evolved far beyond simple drawings. He now created detailed maps for travelers, painted portraits for families wealthy enough to afford such luxuries, and designed decorative elements for the churches and public buildings sprouting up as the territory developed. Joseph's musical abilities had made him a sought-after performer at community gatherings, barn raisings, and the social events that brought isolated frontier families together. He had fashioned a violin from materials available on the homestead, guided by instructions in a book Margaret had ordered from Chicago, and the instrument's sweet voice could move listeners to tears or set their feet dancing depending on his mood. More importantly, both boys had learned to support each other's ambitions rather than competing for attention. Samuel designed illustrated songbooks for Joseph's performances, while Joseph composed melodies that inspired Samuel's most creative artistic work. Their collaboration had become a local marvel, proof that individual excellence could coexist. With fraternal loyalty, Rebecca, now 10 years old, had grown into a child whose wisdom seemed to exceed her years. The near-fatal illness of her early days with Margaret had left her with an appreciation for life's fragility and preciousness that manifested in extraordinary kindness toward all living things. She had established herself as the neighborhood veterinarian for small animals, treating everything from injured birds to sick puppies with a combination of intuitive understanding and knowledge gleaned from every medical text Margaret could acquire. Her gentle manner and evident success with animal patients had led several families to consult her about human ailments as well. While Margaret was careful to ensure Rebecca never overstepped appropriate boundaries, the child's observations about illness and injury often proved remarkably insightful. Margaret suspected Rebecca would eventually pursue formal medical training, though such education remained nearly impossible for women on the frontier. Timothy, approaching his 8th birthday, had transformed from a fearful little boy into a confident child whose storytelling gifts had evolved into genuine literary talent. He wrote elaborate tales of frontier adventure, carefully copying them into notebooks with illustrations provided by Samuel. Several of his stories had been published in the territorial newspaper, earning him recognition as one of the youngest published authors in Montana Territory. Timothy's greatest achievement was his role as the family historian. He had taken it upon himself to record their experiences, creating a detailed chronicle of their life together that captured both the dramatic events and the quiet moments that defined their journey. His written account of their first winter together, Rebecca's illness, and Margaret's transformation from stranger to mother had moved even Judge Caldwell to tears when Timothy read excerpts during a visit. Little Lucy, now 7 years old, remained the family's source of joy and wonder. She approached each day with an enthusiasm that reminded the others why life was worth embracing, even when circumstances were difficult. Her infectious laughter could break tensions, her spontaneous hugs could heal hurt feelings, and her innocent observations often provided exactly the perspective needed to solve seemingly insurmountable problems. Lucy had also developed an unexpected talent for organization, keeping track of everyone's belongings, remembering important dates and appointments, and ensuring that family traditions were maintained year after year. It was Lucy who insisted on celebrating the anniversary of Margaret's arrival each October. Lucy who remembered to save seeds from the best vegetables for next year's garden. And Lucy who somehow knew exactly when someone needed extra attention or comfort. As Margaret watched her children develop their individual talents and personalities, she marveled at how their early experiences had shaped them without defining their limitations. They had learned resilience from surviving abandonment, compassion from experiencing kindness when they most needed it, and confidence from discovering they were worthy of unconditional love. The homestead itself had grown and prospered along with the family. What had once been Thomas Brennan's modest farming operation had evolved into a thriving enterprise that combined agriculture, education, and small-scale manufacturing. They raised crops not only for their own consumption, but for sale to the mining communities and growing towns throughout the territory. Emma's teaching operation had expanded to include a summer boarding program for children whose parents worked seasonal jobs that prevented regular school attendance. Samuel's artistic work and Joseph's musical performances provided additional income, while establishing the family's reputation for cultural sophistication unusual on the frontier. Rebecca's animal doctoring brought in modest fees, but more importantly created a network of grateful neighbors who could be counted on for assistance during difficult times. Margaret had also established herself as a source of practical advice for women facing the challenges of frontier life. Her successful management of a large household on limited resources, combined with her educational background, made her a natural consultant for families struggling with everything from food preservation to child rearing. The small fees she charged for such services, added to her other income sources, had made the family financially secure for the first time since their formation. But perhaps the most significant change was in Margaret herself. The frightened woman, who had arrived in Millbrook seeking security through marriage, had evolved into a confident leader, whose opinions were sought by men and women throughout the territory. She served on the school board for their district, helped organize community events that brought isolated families together, and had been asked to run for the territorial legislature when Montana achieved statehood. Her reputation extended far beyond their immediate community. She received regular correspondence from other women facing similar challenges, widows with children to support, mail-order brides whose situations had not worked out as planned, families struggling to maintain unity in the face of legal or financial difficulties. Margaret answered every letter, offering practical advice and emotional support drawn from her own experiences. Judge Caldwell had become not just an ally but a genuine friend, visiting the homestead regularly to enjoy the family's hospitality and observe their continued progress. He often brought news from the territorial capital and updates on legal developments that might affect frontier families. His backing had been crucial when Margaret applied for the teaching certification that formalized her educational work. "You've created something remarkable here," he told Margaret during one of his visits, as they watched the children working together to harvest the autumn vegetables. "This family has become a model for what's possible when love and determination overcome legal technicalities and social conventions." Margaret smiled as she observed her children's easy cooperation, their instinctive support for each other, and their obvious contentment with their life together. "They created it themselves," she replied. "I just provided the opportunity." But even as their success grew and their security seemed assured, Margaret never forgot the fragility of the happiness they had built. Frontier life remained dangerous and unpredictable, full of threats that could destroy years of careful work in a matter of hours. Drought could ruin crops, accidents could claim lives, economic downturns could eliminate income sources, and the federal government could still implement policies that disrupted territorial communities. More personally, she worried about the children's futures as they approached adulthood. Daniel's plans for legal education would require him to leave the homestead for extended periods, possibly forever if his career took him to distant cities. Emma's teaching talents might be better utilized in established schools rather than their frontier operation. The twins might find greater opportunities for their artistic and musical gifts in cultural centers far from Montana territory. It was a bittersweet irony that her success as a mother was measured by her children's ability to leave her when they were ready to build their own lives. She had given them the security and education they needed to succeed anywhere, which meant they might choose to succeed somewhere else. These concerns came to a head during the autumn of their 5th year together, when a representative from the territorial government arrived with an unexpected proposition. Montana Territory was preparing its application for statehood, and officials wanted to include examples of successful frontier families in their presentation to Congress. The Brennan family story. A mail-order bride who became the adoptive mother of 7 orphan children and built a thriving homestead through education and agriculture represented exactly the kind of success story the territory wanted to highlight. The proposal involved traveling to Washington, D.C., where Margaret and the children would testify before congressional committees about their experiences and the opportunities available in Montana Territory. It was an honor that recognized their achievements and could provide valuable publicity for Margaret's educational work, but it also meant leaving the security of their homestead, traveling thousands of miles to face scrutiny from federal officials, who might not understand or approve of their unconventional family structure. The risks seemed enormous, but so did the potential rewards. After extensive family discussions, they decided to accept the invitation. The opportunity to represent Montana Territory was too important to decline, and the children were excited about seeing the nation's capital and meeting the people who made laws for the entire country. The journey to Washington proved to be an adventure that tested every skill they had developed during their years together. They traveled by train across landscapes that changed from prairie to farmland to mountains, to cities larger than anything the children had ever imagined. They stayed in hotels, ate restaurant meals, and navigated urban environments that bore no resemblance to frontier life. But the real test came when they appeared before the congressional committee tasked with evaluating Montana's statehood application. Margaret found herself facing questions, not just about their family's success, but about the broader implications of frontier life for American society. "Mrs. Brennan," one congressman asked, "your family represents an unusual arrangement by conventional standards. Do you believe such unconventional families can serve as a foundation for stable statehood?" Margaret stood to answer, aware that her words would be recorded in official transcripts and might influence Congress's decision about Montana's future. Behind her, 7 children who had grown from frightened orphans into confident young people waited to hear how she would describe their journey. "Congressman," she replied, her voice clear and steady, "our family proves that America's greatest strength lies not in conforming to traditional patterns, but in creating new solutions to unprecedented challenges. We came together through extraordinary circumstances, but we've built something that serves not just our own needs, but our entire community." She gestured toward the children, each of whom had prepared testimony about their experiences and their contributions to Montana Territory's development. These young people represent the future of American citizenship, individuals who understand that strength comes from supporting each other, that education opens doors to opportunity, and that hard work can overcome any obstacle. The hearing lasted 3 days, during which each family member testified about their experiences, their achievements, and their vision for Montana's future. Daniel spoke eloquently about the need for legal systems that protected unconventional families. Emma demonstrated teaching techniques that had proven successful with frontier children. The twins performed musical pieces and displayed artistic works that showcased the cultural development possible even in remote territories. Rebecca's testimony about caring for sick animals moved several committee members to tears, while Timothy's reading from his family chronicle provided vivid illustrations of frontier life's challenges and rewards. Even little Lucy contributed, explaining with 7-year-old seriousness how important it was for families to stay together, no matter what difficulties they faced. The committee's final report praised the Brennan family as an example of the innovative spirit and adaptive capability that makes the American frontier a laboratory for social progress. Montana Territory was admitted to the Union 6 months later, with specific mention of families like the Brennans, as evidence of the new state's readiness for self-governance. When they returned to their homestead after 6 weeks in Washington, Margaret felt a profound sense of completion. They had not only survived the ultimate test of their family's legitimacy, but had been officially recognized as representatives of American frontier success. Their story had become part of the historical record, proof that love could create families, just as valid and valuable as those formed through conventional means. As she stood on the porch that first evening back home, watching the sunset paint the prairie in familiar shades of gold and crimson, Margaret reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. The desperate mail-order bride who had stepped off a train in Millbrook 6 years earlier seemed like a different person, entirely, someone from a story she had rather than a life she had lived. But every choice made along that journey, every risk taken and every challenge overcome, had led to this. A family bound by love rather than blood. A home built on shared dreams rather than inherited wealth. And a future bright with possibilities that existed precisely because they had dared to create something new from the ruins of what they had lost. The wind carried the voices of her children as they shared stories of their Washington adventure, their laughter mixing with the eternal song of the prairie grass. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new tests of their strength and unity. But tonight, they were simply a family grateful for what they had built together and confident in their ability to face whatever the future might bring. Margaret smiled as she listened to the sounds of home, the comfortable chatter of people who belonged together, the rustle of evening wind through grain ready for harvest, the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night. She had come west seeking a husband and found something far more precious. She had found herself, her purpose, and her true family. And that was a success beyond anything she could have imagined when she first read Thomas Brennan's letter promising a home for a respectable woman willing to travel to Montana Territory. She had traveled much farther than the distance between Philadelphia and Millbrook. She had traveled from loneliness to love, from desperation to purpose, from Margaret Whitfield, the failed mail-order bride, to Margaret Brennan, the mother who had proved that families are made by choice, strengthened by challenge, and defined by the depth of love that binds them together. The years that followed, Montana's statehood brought changes that transformed not just their family, but the entire character of what had once been wild frontier territory. Towns sprouted, where cattle trails had wound through empty grassland. Railroad lines connected isolated communities to distant markets and sources of supply. Telegraph wires carried news and business communications across distances that had once required weeks of dangerous travel to traverse. Margaret watched these developments with mixed emotions. Progress brought opportunities and conveniences that made life easier for frontier families, but it also threatened the close-knit community bonds that had sustained them through their most difficult years. The neighbors who had once depended on each other for survival now had access to commercial services and government assistance that reduced their need for mutual support. But for the Brennan family, change brought primarily positive developments. Daniel's legal studies had progressed remarkably well, aided by correspondence courses and periodic training with established attorneys in Helena and Billings. His combination of formal education and practical frontier experience made him uniquely qualified to handle the legal challenges facing Montana's rural communities. He had already begun taking cases involving property disputes, family law matters, and the complex regulations governing mining claims and water rights. His first major victory came in defending a widow whose husband's business partners tried to claim his property after his death in a mining accident. Daniel's meticulous research and passionate advocacy not only preserved the woman's inheritance, but established important legal precedents protecting the rights of surviving spouses. "You should have seen him in that courtroom," Judge Caldwell told Margaret after witnessing Daniel's performance. "He had the presence and authority of a man twice his age, but with a compassion that comes from understanding what it means to fight for family survival. Montana is going to benefit enormously from having lawyers like him." Emma's educational work had expanded beyond anything Margaret had originally envisioned. She now supervised a network of teachers serving homesteads and mining communities throughout a 3-county area, training young women in the innovative teaching methods she had developed and ensuring consistent educational standards across the region. Her success had attracted attention from university educators in distant cities, leading to invitations to speak at conferences and write articles for educational journals. She had declined offers to relocate to established schools in Chicago and Denver, preferring to continue building educational opportunities for children who might otherwise receive no formal instruction. These children deserve the same quality education available in cities, Emma explained to Margaret when discussing her decision to remain in Montana. Someone needs to prove that excellent teaching can happen anywhere if you care enough to make it work. Emma had also begun training older students to become teachers themselves, creating a pipeline of qualified instructors who understood frontier conditions and could adapt educational methods to local circumstances. Several of her former students now operated their own schools, extending her influence far beyond the communities she could serve directly. The twins had taken their artistic and musical talents in directions that surprised everyone, including themselves. Samuel's map-making skills had evolved into a thriving surveying business as new settlements required precise boundary determinations and infrastructure planning. His artistic eye for detail and mathematical precision made him one of the most sought-after surveyors in the territory. His maps were not merely functional documents, but works of art that captured the beauty of Montana's landscape while providing essential information for travelers, settlers, and business enterprises. Several of his maps had been purchased by the federal government for official use, and he had been commissioned to create decorative maps for the state capitol building. Joseph's musical abilities had led him in an unexpected direction when he discovered a talent for composing songs that captured the experiences and emotions of frontier life. His ballads about homesteader struggles, mining boom towns, and the romance of the American West had begun to spread far beyond Montana. Carried by traveling performers and published in sheet music collections, he had established a small music school in their community, teaching both instrumental techniques and composition to students who showed aptitude. Several of his pupils had gone on to perform professionally, carrying his musical influence to audiences across the expanding nation. That the collaboration the twins had deepened rather than diminished as they pursued their individual careers. Samuel created illustrated songbooks for Joseph's compositions, while Joseph wrote musical accompaniments for Samuel's ceremonial map presentations. Their joint projects had become sought-after attractions at state fairs and cultural events throughout the region. Rebecca's path had taken perhaps the most remarkable turn of all. Her childhood gift for healing animals had evolved into serious veterinary study, through correspondence with agricultural colleges and practicing veterinarians in established cities. She had become the unofficial veterinarian for a vast area, treating everything from valuable breeding horses to family milk cows with a combination of formal knowledge and intuitive understanding. Her success with animal patients had led several human patients to seek her advice about medical conditions, though she was always careful to recommend qualified physicians for serious ailments. However, her herbal remedies and practical nursing skills had proved invaluable in emergencies. When professional medical help was unavailable, Rebecca had begun documenting native plants and their medicinal properties, creating illustrated guides that combined scientific accuracy with practical application instructions. Her work had attracted attention from botanical researchers and medical schools, interested in traditional healing methods used by frontier families. "She has the mind of a scientist and the heart of a healer," observed Dr. William Patterson, a physician from Billings who had consulted with Rebecca on several difficult cases. "If she were a man, she could attend any medical school in the country. As a woman, she's probably accomplishing more good right here than she could in any formal medical practice." Timothy's literary talents had blossomed into a career that brought him recognition far beyond Montana's borders. His stories about frontier life, published in national magazines and collected into books, had introduced readers across America to the realities and romance of Western settlement. His writing captured both the hardships and the heroism of frontier families with an authenticity that came from personal experience. His account of their family's formation and survival had become required reading in schools, studying American westward expansion. While his fictional stories entertained readers who might never venture beyond established cities, Timothy had also begun working as a correspondent for Eastern newspapers, providing detailed reports on Montana's political and economic development. His articles helped shape national understanding of Western territories and influenced federal policies affecting frontier communities. Lucy, now in her early teens, had surprised everyone by developing an intense interest in business and commerce. She kept detailed records of the family's various enterprises, analyzing income and expenses with a sophistication that impressed visiting bankers and business advisors. Her organizational skills had evolved into a natural talent for managing complex operations, and she had begun helping other frontier families establish more efficient systems for their farms and businesses. Several neighboring families had hired her as a consultant to help them increase productivity and profitability. Lucy had also shown remarkable aptitude for understanding markets and economic trends, correctly predicting price fluctuations for agricultural products and identifying profitable opportunities for family enterprises. Margaret often consulted with Lucy before making major financial decisions, trusting her daughter's analytical abilities and practical wisdom. As each child developed their individual talents and pursued their chosen paths, Margaret found herself playing an evolving role as advisor, supporter, and proud witness to their achievements. The desperate need for basic survival that had dominated their early years together had been replaced by the more complex challenge of helping young adults navigate increasingly sophisticated opportunities. But the bonds forged during their years of shared struggle remained strong. Despite their individual successes and the expanding scope of their activities, the children maintained their commitment to family unity and mutual support. Sunday dinners at the homestead brought everyone together to share news, seek advice, and maintain the connections that had sustained them through their most difficult times. These gatherings often included friends, business associates, and visitors from distant places who had come to know the Brennan family's reputation for hospitality and wisdom. Margaret's dining table had become an informal forum where political leaders, business entrepreneurs, educational innovators, and cultural figures gathered to discuss the challenges and opportunities facing Montana and the broader American West. Judge Caldwell remained a regular visitor, though his role had evolved from official protector to family friend and advisor. His presence provided continuity with their early struggles while representing their acceptance into Montana's established leadership community. "You've created something that goes far beyond a successful family," he observed during one particularly lively dinner conversation that included a territorial senator, 2 newspaper editors, and a visiting professor from Harvard University. "This table has become a center of influence that shapes how people think about frontier life and Western development." Margaret smiled at the observation while serving pie that Rebecca had baked using berries Timothy had gathered and Lucy had calculated would provide the perfect balance of sweetness and tartness. The simple domestic scene represented the foundation that supported all their more dramatic achievements, the daily commitment to caring for each other that had never wavered despite their individual successes. As Montana celebrated its 10th anniversary of statehood, Margaret was invited to speak at the commemorative ceremony in Helena. The invitation recognized her role not only as a successful pioneer family matriarch, but as an educator and community leader whose influence had shaped the state's development. Standing before an audience that included the governor, congressional representatives, and business leaders from across the state, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment of recognition. The frightened woman who had hidden 7 children from legal authorities seemed like someone from a different lifetime. Yet the lessons learned during those desperate early months continued to inform every decision she made. "Montana's greatest resource," she told the assembled crowd, "is not our minerals or our agricultural land or our natural beauty, though all of these contribute to our prosperity. Our greatest resource is our willingness to create new solutions to unprecedented challenges, to build families and communities and institutions that serve human needs rather than conforming to arbitrary traditions." She gestured toward the section where her children sat with their spouses and business partners, and the beginning families of the next generation. The children who will inherit this state understand that strength comes not from rigid conformity, but from adaptive creativity, not from exclusion, but from inclusion, not from fear of change, but from confident engagement with whatever challenges the future may bring. The speech was reported in newspapers across the nation, establishing Margaret as a voice representing not just Montana, but the entire American frontier experience. She received invitations to speak at universities, women's organizations, and political conventions throughout the country. But perhaps the greatest measure of their success came in a letter Margaret received from a young woman in Ohio who had read Timothy's account of their family's formation. The woman was facing circumstances remarkably similar to Margaret's original situation. She was alone, without resources, and considering answering a mail-order bride advertisement from a rancher in Wyoming Territory. "I want to thank you for showing me that women have more choices than we sometimes realize," the letter read. "Your story proves that courage and love can create opportunities that don't exist until we have the bravery to pursue them. I've decided not to answer that advertisement, but to use my savings to attend teacher training instead. If you could build a family and a career from nothing, perhaps I can build a life that serves my own dreams rather than just providing security." Margaret read the letter aloud during one of their Sunday dinners, and the response from her children was immediate and unanimous. They wanted to help. Within weeks, they had established a fund to provide assistance for women facing difficult circumstances, offering both financial support and practical advice based on their own experiences. The fund grew rapidly as word spread about its purpose and the family's commitment to helping others create unconventional solutions to challenging situations. They received applications from widows seeking education funding, unmarried mothers needing business training, and young women who wanted alternatives to traditional marriage arrangements. Each case was considered individually, with the entire family participating in decisions about how best to provide assistance. Some recipients needed only financial help, while others benefited more from mentoring relationships that provided ongoing guidance and support. The project gave Margaret's later years a sense of purpose that went beyond her own family's success. She was helping other women discover the same truth she had learned during her desperate journey from Philadelphia to Montana, that conventional limitations existed primarily in people's minds, and that courage combined with determination could overcome almost any obstacle. As she approached her 60th birthday, Margaret looked back on a life that had been shaped by circumstances she could never have anticipated, but that had led to achievements beyond her wildest dreams. The mail-order bride who had sought security through marriage had instead found security through service, building a legacy that would influence generations of families facing their own unprecedented challenges. The homestead that had once been Thomas Brennan's modest farming operation had become the center of a network of enterprises that provided education, cultural enrichment, legal services, and business consultation to communities throughout Montana and beyond. More importantly, it remained a place where love created family bonds stronger than blood relationships and where individual achievements served collective purposes. On quiet evenings when the business of the day was finished and the children had returned to their own homes and responsibilities, Margaret often sat on the porch where she had first heard crying in the wind 30 years earlier. The prairie still stretched endlessly toward distant mountains, but it no longer seemed empty or forbidding. Instead, it represented infinite possibility, space for new dreams to take root, room for fresh starts and unexpected journeys, and the promise that love could create miracles from the most unlikely circumstances. She had come west seeking one life and found another entirely richer and more meaningful than anything she could have imagined. The wind still sang its eternal song across the grassland, but now it carried voices from a dozen homesteads where her former students taught their own children, where her family's influence continued to shape new generations, and where the example of the Brennans proved that families created by choice could be just as strong and lasting as those formed by any other means. As the stars emerged in the vast Montana sky, Margaret whispered her nightly prayer of gratitude for the journey that had brought 7 frightened children and 1 desperate woman together to create something that had blessed not only their own lives, but the lives of countless others who had been touched by their story. She had answered Thomas Brennan's letter seeking a mail-order bride, but she had become something far greater: a mother, a teacher, a leader, and a living example that love knows no conventional boundaries, and that families are defined not by their origins, but by the depth of their commitment to each other's welfare and happiness. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.